Good afternoon. It is Tuesday, May 10th, 2011. I'm Barbara Tinnerman Cecil, and on behalf of Susie Spittler, I want to welcome you to the 8th oral history taping. This time we're going to talk about the schools, and we have a very distinguished panel of administrators, secretaries, and teachers. So I would like to introduce our first speaker. I had the privilege to work with him when I was employed at the high school guidance office, and his principal, Ed Lindinsky. Ed?
Thank you, Barb. Before I begin my soliloquy, I'd just like to say, people oftentimes ask me, how'd you last 28 years at West Milton? And I like to say, I had a big-time love affair. My students, I loved them. I had a great faculty. I had some great parents and adults in the Milton Union School District, and that's what kept me going. Plus, I had Jim Kinnison. How'd I get here? I got here on a phone call from Watt Farrar. And Watt and I had scouted football games in 1956, which was a number of years ago. And we scouted them at Chillicothe High School, and we laugh about it because Watt and I were the rookies, and we would get assignments like from going from West Milton to the other side of Columbus. And while the old timers, they get an assignment maybe traveling from here to Tip City or here to Northmont. So what happened, Watt and I both left Ross County, and we were home one weekend to see my parents. And on my way back, I decided to stop at Cambridge. And when I stopped at this Cambridge roadside, I was looking down at the other end of the rest area, and Carolyn says, "Who are you looking at?" I said, "You know that guy down there?" And I hadn't seen him in about 5 years. I said, "I think that's Watt Farrar." She says, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, remember me telling you I used to scout with him?" Watt's down at the other end, and he's looking down here at me, and Nancy says to Watt, "Who are you looking at?" And Watt says, "I think that's Eddie Lindinsky down there." So what happened, we met and shook hands and et cetera, and I told Watt, I said, "Hey, if there's ever a coaching job that comes up in that area, let me know." I got the phone call. I came up for an interview with Mr. Osborne and Mr. Williams, and they said I had the job, and that's how I got here. As far as principalship, I was working on construction, and Mr. Osborne gave me a call twice, and I wasn't home because we were working overtime. So I called Mr. Osborne. He said, "How about stopping down and seeing me?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll stop down." So we met on Mr. Osborne's front porch, and we had it all, "How you doing, how you doing, how's everything going," et cetera. And Mr. Osborne said to me, "Have you ever thought about getting into administration, Ed?" I said, "You know what, Mr. Osborne?" I said, "The last two schools that I was at, I was asked." But I said, "I always had a pretty good team coming up, and I like coaching, so I never took it." I said, "Why are you asking?" He said, "How would you like to be the next high school principal?" He said, "The board would like for you to be the next high school principal." I said, "Well, where's Jack Williams going?" He said, "Oh, he's going to be moved up to assistant superintendent." I said, "You know what, Mr. Osborne, I got to go home and talk this over with my wife." He said, "Oh, I expect you to do that." So I came in the house, and believe it or not, I had quit smoking. This is on a Thursday I talked to him. I had quit smoking on a Tuesday. And I came home, and I says to Carolyn, "Where's that pack of cigarettes we used to have around here?" She says, "Why do you need a cigarette?" I says, "Sit down, I'm going to talk to you." So we went over it, and we thought, well, let's try for 2 or 3 years. We really enjoyed coaching. And after 2 or 3 years, I says, we can make a decision. I can always get a coaching job. So before you know it, 3 years turned into 5, 5 turned into 10, 10 turned into 15, 15 turned into 23. And that's how many years I was high school principal. One big thing happened when we were coaching here, I'm going to bring out, was Carolyn was sitting down with the kids, and we were playing a team that had, we were going back and forth. They'd win, they'd go up by 1, we go up by 1. They go up by 2, we go up by 2. And Carolyn turned around, and who was in back of her? 3 preachers, and I had all their sons on my team. Bob Fawsey was on my team. Johnny Powell was on my team, and Louis Barrett was on my team. And Carolyn turned around and she said to him, "Look, with you three preachers here and me being a Catholic, why don't we all pray? And he's certainly going to answer one of us. We won by 1 point. I don't know who took the credit for that. But the two big things that came about my first couple of years here was the JVS, which is now the CTC. And the JVS, we really had a number of students who went to the JVS because we promoted it here. And our promotion must have worked pretty good because in comparison to numbers to some of the other big schools, they'd have 800, we'd have maybe 300. And they would send a certain number and we would send a number. Proportion-wise, we came out to be number one in a lot of years, just because we would ask the students, we kept a record of it. What are you going to do when you graduate? Are you going to go to college? No. Are you going to join the service? No. Why don't you go down to the JVS and learn a trade? And the JVS, the reason they were so good is that I think the top three administrators down at the JVS, one happened and they got the school started in the right direction. And consequently, as far as material was concerned, you know, in our high school and other high schools who were going down to the CTC or the JVS at that time, they may have one piece of equipment, while JVS had enough money to buy a whole classroom full of material. So consequently, and we were so good down there that we still have three of our former graduates at Milton Union High School teaching down there. Jack Spittler, Dave Jessup, Mike Buchanan, and Bruce Minkner, who used to be down there, owns his own business now, but them four were teachers down at the CTC now, and they still do good. The other big change that came about was Title IX. And what Title IX did is it gave our girls an opportunity to show off their wares. And their athletic ability was second to none. And when we go and play these other schools, they oftentimes wondered, where'd they get all them good girls? I always said they're good and they're better looking than you had over there. But who deserves a lot of credit is we had the right person at the right time, and that was Sally Dickinson sitting right over there. She went above and beyond in time and expertise, and there are a lot of parents and girls who really should recognize, and they do recognize Sally for what she had done for them. As far as students are concerned, we had what I would like to call educational diversity. In educational diversity, what we did is we would create a program which was educational wise and yet the students benefit. One of them was the career planning day. And what we would do is take a survey among our students as to what profession they would like to have come into the high school and give us a talk. And they would get a question, they would have the opportunity to sit in there, question this particular individual, and we could do that 2 or 3 times in our morning session. The other program that I thought was pretty good, we called it Swap Day. And Swap Day is that the parent, providing they talk to their employees, they would switch a schedule with their son or daughter for a half a day. Or their son or daughter would go and work for their job, they in turn would pick up their schedule and go to classes. And I knew it was good because I would hear some of the girls and some of the guys say, boy, my mom sure does work hard. Or my dad sure does work hard. I'm gonna do more things around the house. The other good program that we had, and it was instituted by the state, was post-secondary education. And that's where the kids got an opportunity to get college credit while they were in high school. And some of our students got approximately 9, 10, 11, 12 credits towards their degree while they were still in high school. So that went over. I came back from a meeting down at the CTC, and the guy sitting next to me, we got talking about what he was doing at his school, and he said they just finished a good program. And I came home and I asked John Neal, I said, John, you know, I heard of a good program down at the CTC. I said, why don't we check it out? He said, what's that? I said, let's call it Senior Government Week. And I think they're still doing Senior Government Week till this day. And what was happening in Senior Government Week is the seniors would get an opportunity to take over the government here in the city. And by that, they would elect their own council members, they would elect their own mayor, fire chief, and they would get a chance to work in the street department, water department, and et cetera. And it was a tremendous experience. Our students did not know some of the things that was happening in the city. And of course, the city workers were really proud of the fact that they would show the seniors what all they did. And they go to a couple of more extremes, I thought, and showing them and getting a little bit of pats on the back. As far as teachers are concerned, the reason I liked our staff, they were very willing in many instances to give up their conference periods for things that we had planned. One of the first things that we had done is, even when I taught high school, you know, I had no idea what was happening over in the elementary building. I just had teachers, had a gang of kids, taught a lot of subjects, and that was it. And I know elementary teachers were not aware of what the high school teachers were doing. So I got with Nick and I said, hey, Nick, let's have a teacher exchange. I says, I'll send my teachers over during their conference period if they wish to go, and you in turn can send your teacher over and see what the high school teachers did. And that went over big time, especially when you were in the faculty lounge and heard the talk in the faculty lounge, or you was down at the lunchroom table, and teachers would be talking about what they learned about the elementary did, and they were strictly amazed. We found out, and Linda Varner was involved in this, and she did a good job. And what Linda did is, you always hear, this is what they're going to do at this school, or this is what they've been doing at this school. Well, we heard that a number of times, and Linda, I called her aside, and I said, Linda, why don't you go over this school and find out just what is actually happening over there? And then when you come back, we'll go over whatever you had seen. So Linda did. She went to this school and found out that, hey, they're just starting to do things that we've been doing for 3 or 4 years, right, Linda? Right. And we were that far ahead of some of these schools that were supposedly to be on the up and up and know what happened. Dave Bean was our head of our math department, and we got talking one day, and I said, you know what, Dave, why do you have to go to Cincinnati? Why do you have to go to Columbus or Toledo in order to find out what's happening in math? I said, a good idea. Why don't I contact 10 area schools, talk to their principal, and have them send their departmental chairman over to us. We'll have a conference up in the library for a half a day. We'll go over shortcomings, strong points, weak points, how you got to certain points. And they thought it was a good idea. So I phoned 10 area high schools, and I talked to their principal and told them what the conference was going to be about. And they got all hipped up, and they said, yeah, we'll send our departmental head over. And after all was said and done, Dave Bean got so many fine compliments about the conference, the math conference that we had. In fact, some of the schools picked it up, and they said they were going to do it something. Maybe not in math, but they were going to do it in some other field. We had a program called A Personal Touch. And in this program, what we actually did, one summer I figured, we have so many failures, why don't I try to find out just why students failed? And they failed from everything, not coming to school, not being in the right class, maybe it was too tough for them, not about 10 or 12 things. So I had a faculty meeting, and I said, this is strictly voluntary. I said, I'm going to assign each one of you who are willing to do it, I'll assign you 2 or 3 kids, and all you have to do is check on them to see how they're progressing. They're going to take the course that they failed last year. And so most faculty members say, yeah, they'd like to do that. I said, you don't have to do anything. Just see the teacher and see them. And if the student is a tough student, send them to me. I'll take care of that. So that's what we did. And lo and behold, we had approximately 70% of the students who failed, someone had showed interest in them and showed a concern for them. And they do it on a weekly basis, a couple times a week. And one of the teachers says to me, Ed, what am I supposed to do with this? So I came up with a statement that I thought they should follow. And it read, do all that you would want someone to do if the student was your daughter, your brother, your sister, whom you love, and they needed assistance. Now, how are you going to argue with that? I don't even know how I came up with that, but it was a good one. It was a good one. I don't know, someone got hit by a lightning bolt or something that particular day. So the one thing, Jim Kennison and I, Jim was my first assistant principal, and Jim had all the qualities that you would want in an assistant principal. And I had 4 of them. I had Jim, I had Watt Farrar, God rest his soul, I had Mike Jones, and I had Alan Smith. But Jim started it off. And the reason I say so much about Jim is Jim had all the qualities that you would want. He had mental toughness. He wasn't afraid to dish out punishment if it so was the fact. He didn't always agree with me, and that was good. And that was good because I needed someone to explain to me that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, you know, in some instances. And Jim was the man who would do that. So what happened, after school would let out, Jim and I would always go and we'd walk around the track and talk over the day. And as we walked, we'd discuss what happened and what we're going to do. And I says to Jim, I said, you know what's wrong in this town, Jim? And Jim started laughing. He said, no, Ed, tell me what's wrong in this town. I said, no one does anything for senior citizens. He says, you know, Ed, you're right. No one does anything for senior citizens. He says, what are you doing, Ed? I said, you know, Jim, I'm going to come up with an idea tomorrow. I says, tomorrow morning we're going to get together. So what happened, I came up with this idea. We were going to invite the senior citizen group to a pep assembly. And I came in and I told Jim, I said, hey, Jim, let's invite them to a pep assembly. He said, a pep assembly? I said, Jim, just think, someone 65, 70 years old. When was the last? I said, maybe they didn't even have pep assemblies at that time, Jim. And we started laughing about it. So what I had to do is I had got the student council together and took them down to the course room. And I told them what Jim and I had in mind as far as Senior Citizen Day. And I told them I'd like for them to be an escort. And they're looking at me like, you know, giving me that nod. And you can see the wheels turning in their head. I said, look, what's wrong with showing an act of kindness? I said, is there anything wrong with being kind to someone? I says, what's wrong with making a senior citizen smile? Can you find something wrong with that? And they'll just look at me, blank look, and they're shaking their head no. And I said, when was the last time that any of you held the hand of a senior citizen who wasn't your grandma or your grandpa? Raise your hand. I think one hand went up. And I says, now, we're going to need chaperones, and that's what I expect out of you. I said, can you be a chaperone? I said, there's only one requirement if you're going to be a chaperone. And I said, you have to put your arms around that senior citizen, give him a big hug, and give him a kiss on the cheek. I said, that's the only requirement. Hands went up. So I phoned Horace Fogel, and many of you know Horace Fogel. I called him. I gave him the name. He was the Romeo of Hollywood. And whenever we had a senior citizen program, Horace was always just sharp. I mean, he was always came looking sharp. So I said, Horace, I says, this is Ed Lendinsky. And I said, we'd like to do something for the senior citizen. By God, it's about time someone does something for the senior citizen. I said, Horace, we're going to do it. And I says, the first thing we're going to do is invite you to a pep assembly. He said, a pep assembly? I said, that's right. He said, we'll be there. So what happened, we had our students sign up to be chaperone. Malcolm Smoot took care of the parking lot when they came in. We had student council members take their coat, put them on a hanger, and we sat them in the middle of the gym. Remember, Jim? Middle of the gym. And I'll tell you what. Remember that, Sally? And we sat there, and I'll tell you what, that pep assembly went wild. It went wild. I couldn't believe it. The kids were cheering for and I think they were cheering for the senior citizens, not for the team to win, but they wanted to show senior citizens. And I think what this actually did, it bridged the generation gap. Senior citizens found out that not all high school students are bad. You know, you read the paper, and not necessarily our students, but you read about other students, and this is how kids are nowadays, not ours. And what happened, we went to big time entertainment with that program. In fact, Debbie Kurtz, she coined this. She said that this is the, she called it, this is the social event of the year for a lot of senior citizens. And it really was. We had the Air Force Band come in twice to perform. We had hypnotists come from Toledo and performed. We had a magician come. We had a guy who played a 10-string instrument perform down in Dayton at one of the nightclubs, and I invited him up. And what happened, when you walked in the gym on that day, every organization, Student Council on World Affairs, band, club, Spanish club, etc., they made a banner. And those banners may be extended from here to the wall. And they would have different sayings on. Senior citizens are like Superman, or senior citizens are like superwomen. And we put up the baskets and came down with a banner from the baskets that we had the Dayton Daily News come up here. And we got some real good advertisement on it because they gave us a full-page spread and showing pictures what had happened, etc. And then I thought, well, we had the Air Force Band in, so I phoned Bowling Green. I don't know why I did this, but I phoned Bowling Green and talked to their music department. And the guy I talked to, I don't even recall his name, but I says, and I told him about the senior citizen. I said, why don't you send someone down here to perform, and we'll pay you this amount of money. And he said, what kind of music do you want? I said, have a kaleidoscope of music. And he says, well, he says, when is this going to be? And I told him, and he says, you know, our 60 male choral group is going to perform going south. He said, why don't we stop off and have a performance at your school, and we'll take it from there. We did that. Next year, I phoned Miami University. And I got talking to him, and the guy was sort of hesitant. And I thought, you're not going to pull this stuff on me, buddy, you know. I said, hey, I says, you know, we send a lot of students to the Mid-American colleges. And you know Miami, who came down, it was Bowling Green. And I said, they really put on a show for us. You know, I thought I'd put a little pressure on this guy. We'll see if he cracks. Sure enough, he said, oh, we can come down and perform for it. So Miami University sent their choir down to perform for the senior citizens. Now, the teachers really enjoyed the senior citizens. And Linda Varner, thank goodness I had her, what she would do is down in the cafeteria, all the senior citizen did after the program would come down, sit down, the kids would, their chaperone would get up, take a tray of food over to them, they would eat, and Linda her classes decorated all the tables, which was nice. And we said, whatever number you had on the bottom of your seat, you could have the prize or something. We did that. But I got one story I want to tell. Do I have time to tell a story? This is a sentimental story. And I got a chance. I was invited to the National Principals Association out at Las Vegas. And I took this slide with me. What happened, Jim and I used to go out and talk to the bus drivers about how everything was going and they need any assistance and this and that. And this particular day, as I'm walking back to school, who comes and said, hey, Mr. Lendensky? And I said, yeah, and it was Mrs. Halstern. You may remember Mrs. Halstern. And she said, Mrs. Halstern, she said, Mr. Lendensky, could my mom come to Senior Citizen Day? I said, sure, she can come. She said, but there's a problem, Mr. Lendensky. And I said, what's the problem? She said, she's in a Brethren rest home up in Greenville. I said, that's not a problem. I said, just give me her address. I'll send her a letter, and we'll invite her down. So I got a card back from Mrs. Halston's mom, and she said, I will definitely be there because this is my 72nd birthday. Well, what happened that week, believe it or not, on Tuesday, I get a phone call from the housemaid of the hypnotist in Chicago who was to perform. And she tells me, she says, Mr. Lendensky, he can't perform on Friday. Don't, you know. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I said, well, I hope he gets well, and this and that, and I hung up. So I'm thinking, what? This is Tuesday. Who am I going to get to perform? on Wednesday, I don't know, the man upstairs looked out for me in a number of times, because who walked in is one of our graduates, and my secretary said, Mr. Lendensky, there's someone here to see you, a former graduate. I said, send him in. So who walked in was Joe Rosengarten. You remember Joe Rosengarten? Joe Rosengarten walked in, and he says, how things going, Mr. Lendensky? I said, good. I said, what are you doing, Joe? And he was performing at the Holiday Inns from up in Michigan. He would perform on the weekends or during the week. Then he'd move to the next one. He was over in Indiana at this time. And he says, that's what I do. He said, you said everything's going okay, Mr. Lendensky? I said, yeah, Joe. He said, Mr. Lendensky, you don't have any entertainment for your senior citizen. I said, Joe, you're right. He said, I'll tell you what, Mr. Lendensky. He said, I'll perform. I said, Joe, I only have, and I had so much money that I had always set aside for the senior citizen. He said, I don't even want it. And I said, no, Joe. He said, no, Mr. Lendensky, I don't want paid. I said, look, I have this money appropriated. This school has a lot of money. Sheila wasn't on the board yet at that time. But we had a lot of money at that time, and I said, Joe, I said, you take it. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Mr. Lendensky. He said, I'm going to hire someone to play the drums. I said, great. But I said, Joe, you got to do me a favor. And he said, what's that? I says, you know how we always called senior citizens up? And Jim and I would make up stories about world's greatest bowler, or someone went to Las Vegas and broke the bank. Jim and I were concocting these stories. So, but anyhow, I says, when I call this lady, Mrs. Helston's mom, I says, you know, we're going to bring them up on a stage now. I says, when I say the word, she is definitely going to be here because this is her birthday. I said, I'll have a student on each end pulling the cords. We will open up the curtain, and you'll play Happy Birthday. I said, how will that be? He said, one other thing, Joe, you got to keep in mind, I got Lawrence Welk group in here now, you know. And I said, then I got the bebops over here. I said, so you're going to have to concoct something, Joe, that pleases both. He said, Mr. Lendensky, I'll have him dancing in the aisle. And he really did. A couple got up and actually danced in the aisle. But anyhow, so what happened, Mrs. Helston's mom came up, and Jim and I presented her with a flower. And I said she was definitely be here because today was her birthday. The curtain opened up. Joe started playing Happy Birthday. And believe it or not, the student body stood up and sung Mrs. Helston's mom Happy Birthday. And Jim Hauser was my photographer, and he would always make slide presentations. And this picture that he had Mrs. Helston's mom with a tear coming down like that. So that's my sentimental story, and he really went over good. And like I said, the man upstairs took good care of me and gave me great assistant principals. And like I always said, when things were going good, I always prayed. And I'll tell you what, and the reason you should pray when things are going good, because everyone prays when they're going bad. So that was one of my things. So I'm done, and I'd like to introduce my first assistant principal. And he was just great because of the character he had, because of the intestinal fortitude he had, and he didn't always agree with me, but his ideas were always taken into consideration. And in fact, I adopted plenty of them. So I have to leave. I have an appointment, but next on the agenda is my very good friend, Jim, my very good friend, and my first assistant principal, Jim Kinnison. And I thank you all for listening to my stories and what have you.
Thank you, Ed. As Ed's pretty well covered it, I think I'll go too now. Seriously, I came to Milton Union in 1971. And prior to that, after graduating from college, I'd been in a small town in northern Ohio for a couple of years. And went to a school in Michigan north of Detroit for 10 years. After that, wanting to get around home again, I wound up down at Stebbins High School in 1969, 70, and 69, 70, 70, and 71, teaching and coaching down there. I'm not sure how, anyway, I found out from someone that Milton Union was going to have an assistant principal for the first time. So I'd been working on my principal's license, and I was about done with it. So I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. And Jack Williams was there, and Jack had been my math teacher in high school. So I came and applied, and at the same time, I had a job that I thought I was going to get coaching in another school on the east side of Dayton. And Jack called me and he said, well, he said, we're considering you, but the thing will be, I need to know right now if you would take it, if we would offer it to you, if you would take it. Well, I thought I had a pretty good chance for this other job, but I said, yeah, I'd take it. So he said, well, we'll let you know. And I thought, oh, shoot. Maybe I gave the wrong answer. So anyway, a couple of days passed, and he said, well, we've decided that you'll be the man for the job. So I'm not sure when, but I came up and met Ed. And after I talked to Ed, I'm thinking, am I going to be the right guy for this? Ed was different. Ed was very different. So I thought, yeah, I can handle this. So we had a lot of good times. He was talking about JVS, and I can remember the first year or two, scheduling didn't go well. There were always problems, little differences in scheduling and so forth, and especially the bus schedule in the morning. And we would get there probably 45 minutes before school started, go around, check the building, any last minute things we had to discuss, we would do that. And then when the kids came, I should have mentioned that as an assistant principal, I was in charge of attendance and the attendance reports and discipline. So after I had taken the job and I was on the job, Jack said, oh yeah, he said, I forgot. He said, you're also going to have to be in charge of student council. Okay. So anyway, we would get there early in the morning. We would do our last minute, whatever we needed to do for the day. And then I would get into the attendance office and, be doing whatever needed to be done. And pretty soon I said, hey, Jim, come on down here. I get down. There were 3 students. Missed the JVS bus. I drive them down to JVS. This happened 3 times, 4 times a week. I mean, I felt like a taxi driver sometimes taking kids down there. The bus schedule finally worked out, and everything went fine. And that probably was the greatest thing that ever happened to a lot of kids that came to this school. I think a lot of the kids never would have made it through without JVS at that time. Ed mentioned also, after school, we would walk around the track, what track we had there at the football field. And we would discuss, anything and everything that pertained to the school and how things were going. Probably, I don't know what year it was when I was there, we came up with a little problem. We didn't have a cheerleader advisor. So Ed and I wound up being cheerleader advisors. Well, we knew nothing about it, except they make a lot of noise and they jump a lot. So we were the cheerleader advisors, and we would be out. One thing we did do, and I think they got in better shape then than they had before, because they would always have to run a lap around the track before practice, and then a lap afterwards, and we'd run with them. So that worked out for a while, and it went pretty good, except there was an away football game, and I think it was at Vandalia. And I was getting down from the stands after the game, and I was assailed by a parent. What kind of advisor are you for these cheerleaders? You're not, you know, and on and on and on. Oh my golly. Well, that was about the only time we really got attacked on it. And luckily, we did get an advisor before we ruined the whole cheerleading. Then after a while, Jack informed me again, well, we have another job for you now. Now you're also going to be athletic director, as well as student council advisor, assistant principal. And so I thought, oh my golly, at least I know a little bit about athletics. So the days were long, the nights were long, the weekends were long. And that's about the time that Title IX came in. And I'll say this, that we probably had the best person, the best female that we could have had at that time to initiate Title IX, because Sally, even though it doesn't look like it now, she worked her tail off with this scheduling games, and it wasn't fun, was it? And it was a lot of hard work. But Milton did develop some pretty good girls' teams, as it turns out. After my stint, and the other thing I'd like to comment on is the faculty we had at Milton Union. They were sort of a special bunch. If you wanted something done, and Ed was never at a loss to ask for something special done.
See me.
But but anyway, if you wanted something special done, they were always more than willing to help out, and it made things a lot easier. From there, I went to the middle school, or the junior high at that time. Junior high was in the McKinley building, and that was a building my mother went 12 years to and graduated from. I spent 6 years there. As a child, I spent the first 6 years there before I came over to the high school. So it was not a new building. It was a building that needed a lot of things. And we had, I think one of the reasons we got out of that building finally was we had a girl that was confined to a wheelchair. And she had classes on the second floor and the third floor and the first floor. Well, there's no elevators. There was no way to get her up and down. And believe it or not, I sort of cringe at this today, but kids would actually put her on their back and take her up the stairs and down the stairs. And it wasn't the best way, I guess, it was the most convenient. It may not have been the best way of getting her around. But it worked. We never had an accident, and her parents were very grateful that the kids would do that. So I think that's probably what caused us to get out of that building. It was just not handicapped accessible, and we were open for a lot of liability after that. Well, anyway, we finally got out of the McKinley building and went to the middle school. Actually, it was the elementary, and we went to a 6, 7, 8 configuration as a middle school, and then the elementary was kindergarten through 5. Pardon me. That went well. I mean, we had some problems going from building to building. I think one of the things that strikes me the most, parents were, especially 6th grade parents, the first year we went over, were just scared to death that their kids were going to be devoured by the old kids, you know? And, you know, it didn't turn out that way, of course, but there were so many parents afraid that if they got those knew those sixth grade kids in with the seventh, eighth grade kids, they'd be corrupted and they would be afraid and they'd be intimidated, and it turned out it worked out fine, and that was probably the best configuration to have after all. Looking back, I can see a lot of differences between when I was a student at Milton Union and when I was there as a supervisory role. I'm thinking about noontime. When we were kids, we went downtown for lunch. I mean, you know, you go down and get a hamburger and a Coke, or a hamburger and a bowl of chili at the restaurant downtown at hers. We weren't allowed, kids weren't allowed out when I was here as an administrator. And it's probably a good thing they weren't. We didn't have all the temptations, I think, when I was in school that kids did later when I was there as an administrator. There were drugs and all sorts of things, you know, that were sort of inviting the kids, and probably a good thing that we didn't do that they stayed at the school. Ed mentioned pep assemblies. I think we had some really wild pep assemblies.
Great pep assemblies.
Huh?
Great pep assemblies.
We had really had some wild ones. And of course, I think probably one of the things that promoted a lot of this was when Ed would get up and talk. Ed was real raw, and he would get up and give a fiery speech, and of course the students then would break up. They would go nuts. I think I'm having a little competition there. So anyway, those are most of the things I remember about my time at Milton Union, and I'm sure Charlie can probably find some others that we haven't talked about, but I'm going to turn it over to Charlie now. Charlie Tomlin, elementary principal at Milton Union High School for 100 years.
Not the high school.
At Milton Union Elementary for 100 years.
100 years.
Or less.
Or
How many
less.
was it, Charlie?
20 years.
20 years, okay.
I started teaching 1950. I graduated from Ohio State. I thought I was going to work on the highway department all my life because that's where I worked that summer before I started teaching. I didn't have a teaching job until August the 24th, 1950. Some man at this school, Brown Township up in Miami County, got called back into the Navy during the Korean conflict, and they needed a history teacher, and I was the last one left. And I signed a contract 2 days before I was to start my first classes the day after Labor Day. I had 7 preparations from geography to American history with a little biology thrown in between. And in the first 2 years at Brown Local, I taught everything but home ec. I couldn't sew and I couldn't cook, so I didn't qualify. But back then, teachers didn't have one assignment. They taught anything that nobody else wanted to teach, regardless of whether you were certified or otherwise. I taught arithmetic. I taught it all the school was 7 through 12, Brown Township. A great school, and I had great people to work with there. I stayed with Miami East for 13 years. The last 7 years, or the last 6 years, I was an administrator. When they consolidated the schools at the end of 1957, Brown Township became Miami East Conover. And they needed a principal. I was working on my principal's license at the time. And I took that job, graduated the Miami East Conover class, 1958. The next year I served as their junior high principal. We had 7th, 8th grade at Conover. Year after that, I moved to the new Miami East High School, which they're going to tear down in a little while because of they're going to build a new one. That was a brand-new school. It had been open 1 year when I took the principalship. I stayed there 4 years, and for Ed, when he became principal, he was just the principal. I was the athletic director. I was also in charge of the bookstore, which you had to sell the bookstore workbooks and stuff out of. I was in charge of that. I had no secretary. If I needed a secretary to do anything, I used the superintendent's secretary. But if she was busy, I had to do my own typing, and I'm one of these kind of typers. But I got very proficient at it. And I also taught biology, and I had a study hall. I had 20 teachers and 400 students. It was before Title IX, thank goodness. But I was in charge of making all contracts for athletics and so on. So I spent many a night at home doing what I should have been doing at school, and it got kind of tiring. And for 4 years, I did that. About the 4th year, I was getting very tired, especially when you had to get out and mow the football field before football game, and I did that as well. I even limed it, using my young son, who didn't know what he was doing, and I couldn't tell him. But anyway, in 1963, I was pretty much fed up with it, and so I had a guidance counselor. He was an older gentleman, a lot older than I was. He'd been administrator before that. Emerson Broombaugh was his name, and I went to Emerson and I sat down and I said, I'm getting tired of this job. He said, I can understand that. I've been watching you. You've been my guidance man for 3 years. And I said, I'm thinking about changing. And I knew Jack Williams from having worked with him on athletics. And he finally convinced me to come over here and play against Milton in a football game. We scored the first touchdown that night, and from there on it was downhill. I think we got beat 66-6. But anyway, Jack and I developed a friendship, and so I called him and I said, I understand you got a job over there for principal, elementary principal. I said, I've never had any elementary experience except for 7th and 8th grade, but that qualified me. I had 7th, 8th grade teaching experience. And he said, do you want the job? And I said, well, I don't know. I'll come over and talk. And well, I knew Mr. Osborne, too. There had been some meetings with him as well. He said, well, come over and talk to Bob. I said, okay, I'll do that. So he made me an appointment. I came over. Bob Osborne talked to me for about 5 minutes. And he said, I'll let you know. I was getting pretty tired at that time. After he said, I'll let you know. And I said, okay. I was fed up with Miami East at the high school. I was tired. I told my wife, I said, get Tim and Mark ready. We're going to go. I'm going to take my vacation. As soon as I close the door down there, I'm going on vacation. Well, I was in Georgia on Tuesday morning. In Georgia, Bob Osborne called me because I had given him phone number. No, he had to call Mr. Nace over at Miami East to see where my phone number was. He called me down there and said, I hired you last night. I said, oh my goodness. I left on Sunday, got that on Monday. But anyway, and I said, well, could you give me till noon to decide? And he said, yeah, I'll give you till noon to decide. And I hung up and I said to my wife, I said, Doris, they've offered me the job at over at Milton at the elementary principal, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And she said, well, why'd you tell him till noon? You knew you wanted the job. Why didn't you tell him? So I waited till noon anyway to call him back because told him I took the job. I came to Milton and He said, you've got 15 teachers. I think there was 3 men and 12 women. And I'm going to read them off because I remember them all. In the 4th grade, I had Maria Hirschberger. It was the first time she met me. She said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 37 years old. She said, my goodness, I'm old enough to be your mother. I never forgot that. The day she was in the building getting something ready to go to school. Elsie Gerhardt, Lois Haynes, Esther Bernheisel, and May Raymert were my 4th grade teachers. 5th grade teacher was Sheila. Sheila was just starting to teach. You hadn't taught too many.
I hadn't taught too many years.
Yeah, right. She hadn't taught too many years, but she and I are the same age.
He's older than I.
Yeah, slightly. Anyway, I had Maud Krieger, Mabel Helsinger, Catherine Loxley, who I talked to the other day, Sheila.
Oh, did you?
She's 92 years old. She's going wild. And I'm going down to see her here shortly. And Mary Noyes. And Mary Noyes, some of you knew her, maybe had known her, but Mary Noyes was an artist. But she was also a great 5th grade teacher because she challenged the kids. She challenged them. I remember at Thanksgiving, she went up there and she drew a turkey on the blackboard. And she said, now I want you all to draw a turkey. And she erased hers. And some of the kids, what am I doing? Huh? They didn't know what to do. She said, that's what I mean. You saw what I did, now do it. But she was trying to test the artistic ability of those children. She was good. And I came into the building. I decided, well, I'd have class meetings. I'd call the teachers in, the 5 4th graders and the 5 5th graders, 5 6th graders. And we'd have our individual meetings. So I got to know them well. I got to know them pretty well by that time. But anyway, first day that Bev Marshall showed up, she was my secretary. I said, what do you do here? And she said, well, I do this, 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 and this. And I said, my goodness, I've never had a secretary. I just wanted to know what you did for this school. And Bev served me for about, it must have been around 10 years. I can't recall. But she was a great secretary and a great person. And then we got Nan Guthrie. I got Nan Guthrie for the rest of my time there, and she was something special as well.
You didn't name your 6th grade teacher.
Oh, the 6th grade teachers were Lucille Hatfield, Tom Gibson, who's still around, Glenda Kingery, Lowell Fullerton, and John Nyheiser. Of course, Aurelia and Elsie and Lois and May are all gone. Maud's gone and Mabel's gone. And Mary Noyes is gone. Lucille is gone. I haven't kept up with Nyheiser. The last I knew was still alive, but I'm not sure. Lowell's gone and Glenda Kingery's gone. Glenda was only with me for 1 year. And her 2nd year with me, she had some physical difficulties. But I think the one thing I remember about the elementary, I tried to make teachers like me because, you know, you can get along better if they all like you. They don't have anything against you. But they used to keep records, attendance records. The teachers in the elementary school each kept their own attendance record, and they had to turn in a report every month of the number of absent and blah, 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 all that. And then you would get all those from 15 teachers, and you had to compile them. And if you made a mistake with one, you had to go find it. And I looked at that and I said, my goodness gracious, that's totally unnecessary. It might be hard for the teachers in the classroom. They didn't like to do it. So I told Bev, I said, go get some attendance books just like they've got. You put every kid's name in the 4th grade in that attendance book. You're going to keep attendance every morning. And we aren't going to depend on the teachers. So if you make a mistake and I make a mistake at the end of the month, we can find it pretty quickly. I took that off the teacher's shoulders. Man, I was in. Remember that, June?
Oh, yes.
Anyway, we stayed in that building for 2 years, and they decided to make it a junior high. And we moved into the new building, which was the south end of the present complex there that houses K through 8 now. And I remember about the move. We knew we were going in there in the fall of '65, and the bus drivers, the trucks around the school, anybody that could gather up something, started moving furniture the last 2 days of school. And the last day of school, or next to last day of school, she would take her 5th grade books. Every kid carried his own big pile of books, and away we walked across to the new school and put them on the bookshelves, and we were ready to go in the fall. So when the building opened up in the fall, we were all ready. We were ready to go. It was organized pretty well. And we opened there with a few more teachers and a few more students. I think at one time we had a class, one class was over 200. Then it started to dwindle, and it's kind of leveled off since, and you have about the same number of students in there as you have for several years. It hadn't changed that much. When we had that, we had no special classes. You didn't have, it was all, every child just spent his time in his room. We did have reading separated to the better ones down, so we could make an effort to help those that had more difficulty. And each teacher was assigned to that one level of students to reading. We had all kinds of things, and we just had a great time in that building for how many years, Julie? We were in, well, 17 years. I was there, 17 years in the building. In 1971, our school population was getting so large, and the anticipated growth was greater, that they built the 2-story wing in between, connected to 2 buildings. That was in 1971. That was the last bond issue that Bob Osborne was able to get through. That was one building that went up when we had some money left over. We had money left over. They built the building and saved money. I think it was somewhere around $200,000 they had. And wisely, they put it into a permanent improvement fund because it could only be used for building after that. And so some of the things that took place later was that money was used for. Mr. Mr. Osborne, of course, retired, I think in 1971 or 72, and later passed away with a heart attack while he was walking on the streets of West Milton. Jack Williams took over as superintendent when Mr. Osborne retired, and it was a pleasant working relationship that I had with Jack, as I'm sure a lot of the other administrators at the time did, because Jack was one of us. He had grown up with us. He was a high school principal when I came here, and he was one of us, and he's still a great friend today. I just talked to him the other evening. He's now 86 years old. He's got arthritis like the rest of us. He's got other problems as well physically, but he's still Jack when you talk to him. I don't know. I had a pleasant 20 years, except for the last one, and I don't need to you know, badmouth anybody, but the last year was not a good year for me. I had a room smaller than, well, Jim would know how small the room was upstairs, one of them little rooms off the main office. I spent my last year in that room. I did buses and writing curriculum. And you know, it was hard going up to the semester, but it was easy coming down because I knew there was going to be an end to it, you know, because that's the year I retired. That's when Jim ran me out of my building in my office. He took it away from me. And he came over and took care of the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I remember I was coming at the end of my contract in 1983. I was coming to the end of my contract, and I asked, what was his name? Who was the superintendent at that time?
Dr. Imhoff.
Stan Imhoff?
Stan Imholtz. I asked him if I had an option, because I was the oldest administrator in the business. I was even older than he was and much wiser. But anyway, yeah, I know, I need to end it. But anyway, I had a great time at West Milton. And a lot of things have changed since I left. I know I didn't have a computer in my office in 1983. I couldn't have used it anyway because I didn't know anything about it. But they did have one upstairs. I guess they used a little bit of it. So, but other than that, you know, sometimes we have to have other people to help us in our quests and help us in our efforts to get things done at school. The greatest custodian that ever lived was Glenn Hart, bar none. Now, I argue with anybody. He was my friend. He was my mentor at a lot of, and he taught me how to fish well, although I knew how to fish. But we had ladies who helped us too. Bev Marshall was great. Nan Guthrie was great. And if Nick was here, he would say Norma Knoll was great. Norma, it's yours.
Thank you. Was the Milton Union primary secretary for 32 years, from 1965 to 1997. And that was quite a surprise to me because when I graduated from Newton High School, the superintendent there, Mr. Hurley, asked me to be his secretary. And I said, no, the last place on earth I want to be working is in a school. But in 1965, when my children were both in school, Mr. Don Kessler was the principal at the primary school. It was then a primary, which was just kindergarten through the 3rd. And he was in need of a secretary. There was also a need for a secretary at the junior high. So different ones mentioned to me, why didn't I apply for the job? And I thought, well, why not? I want something to do. So I did, and thought in 30 years, I'm out of here. But in 20-some years, Mr. Donaldson, who was principal, retired, and 5th grade teacher Jenny Rammel became the principal. And it was like a new job to start with a new principal, and I enjoyed very much working with Mrs. Rammel. I moved to West Milton in 1957 with a 9-week-old baby boy, and we lived on the corner of Stillwater and Jay. And when I looked out my picture window, I saw nothing but a cornfield where today is the complex of the elementary and junior high. We watched the building be built there, and I imagine we'll watch it being torn down. This community at that time was primarily a farming community and a very close-knit family. Mr. Osborne was superintendent that hired me, And as I said earlier, Donald Kessler was the principal of the primary. A real gentleman, always, every day came to work with a tie and a white shirt and a suit, and was always Mr. Kessler. Orville Boyd was the custodian. Wonderful, wonderful man. Was a great help to me in many ways. This was a time when everyone read Sally, Dick, and Jane. It was a time when new math was introduced. Any of you listening to this program would have been students at that time. You're now in your 50s, older and wiser. At that time, we had 6 third grades, 7 second grades, 8 first grades, and 6 half-day kindergartens. I would like to mention some names like Charlie did, because I worked with some wonderful teachers through the years, and it's good to remember the ones that were there in the beginning. Mrs. Harshbarger, Mrs. Henderson, Miss Schwerking, Mrs. Seiler, Mrs. Studebaker, Mrs. Vance at 3rd grade. 2nd grade, Mrs. Arts, Mrs. Dittmer, Mrs. Doles, Mrs. Foreman, Miss Hartley, Mrs. Spittler, Miss Younce. At 1st grade was Mrs. Bradshaw, Mrs. Carper, Mrs. Helsinger, that was Beverly Helsinger, Mrs. Lowry, Mrs. Robbins, Miss Bagert, Miss North, and Mrs. Walls. Our 6 half-day kindergarten teachers were Maribel Dickey, Brenda Hager, and Charlotte Foreman. At that time, we didn't have any special teachers, no phys ed, no art. The classroom teachers did it all. And they had a classroom of 28 to 30 students. We did have a music teacher, Marie Mueller, and Marie didn't have a classroom. She had a piano that was on wheels and went room to room. We didn't have a nurse. We didn't have an assistant principal. We didn't have a guidance counselor. Nick Donaldson was principal, and he had over 800 students at that time. It was a very close-knit staff. Everyone, I believe, at that time lived in West Milton or in the school district. And you saw them at church on Sunday. You saw them down at the stores, in the local groceries. Our school then grew to where we had first graders. We had 10 first graders, and I think you mentioned one class of 200 and some. That was the class.
That's it.
10 first grades. And we had to move the kindergarten over into our churches. We just had, I think, at one time, 925 students, K-3.
And I had some 3rd grade teachers. One year, we had about 4 3rd grade teachers.
Okay. I'd like to mention the school lunches. We had great cafeteria staff. They would come in early in the morning and actually fry chicken in the cafeteria. It was so good. They would peel the potatoes and mash the potatoes.
Make oatmeal cookies.
And chocolate cake with a caramel icing that everyone, loved.
Like eating a big brownie.
My job as secretary was a little bit of any and everything. It even included me selling ice cream and popsicles to the students during their noon hour. I also sold school supplies. And kindergartners had milk to drink during their half day and had to take a nap during their half day. Injured students, there wasn't any nurse, so I was the nurse. I remember one time a little boy cut his head badly, obviously needed stitches. I called his mother, who was at work. She said, well, we doctor with Dr. Stout right there in West Milton. Could you take him down there? I took him to Dr. Stout, and I thought, good time for me to watch a child get a stitch. I went in with the child, and Dr. Stout started and stopped and said, go sit down. I sat down. Mr. Boyd had a greenhouse, and on Mother's Day, the students would walk over to Mr. Boyd's house on Market Street and buy Mother a little flower. I also remember one time when the circus came to town for our school. The big tent was put up, and everyone walked over and watched the circus. The bad thing was it had rained and it ruined the practice field.
Especially with the elephant running around.
Yes, the elephant ran around right through the mud. We had Halloween parades, which were always a big fun thing. Another thing that was quite different back in the 60s and 70s was dress codes. Mostly, I remember the staff's dress code. Everyone wore hose, spiked high heels, dresses, suits, and no one was to wear pants or pantsuits. One day, one of our first grade teachers came to school in a pantsuit. Oh, the word spread through the building so quickly. Oh, is she going to get in trouble? Well, she didn't get in trouble, and she broke the ice, and that was the beginning of wearing pantsuits and slacks.
It had to be suits. It had to be suits.
It had to be suits at first, yes. It had to be a dressy pantsuit. Cincinnati Zoo came to visit and brought little lion cubs that walked down the hall and into the auditorium, and we got to see all those beautiful little animals. And Mr. Ratley used to have an animal show that everyone enjoyed. The PTO and the volunteers, oh, I was so appreciative of volunteers because with so many hats to wear, it was a big help to me to have volunteers. I also had high school girls and boys who would volunteer to come over while I ate lunch and watched The Office. Otherwise, I guess I would have ate at my desk. The way it was, I could go over into the faculty lounge and have my lunch and have a nice break. So I really want to make note of those high school students. We had to walk outside to get to our school library because the middle two-story addition wasn't there. So rain or shine, we walked over to the elementary library. Later, after the building was built, we had to walk over there to go to lunch, which it was all under roof, but if you can imagine little first grade kids going through 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, that was quite an experience. It was hard for me to get through the halls to go over for lunch.
And they changed classes.
Yes, yes, the bell would ring and the junior high kids would come pouring out of the rooms as you were walking down the hall. But they were always courteous and there were no accidents. Bus drivers, they're a wonderful group. I enjoyed working with all of our bus drivers and they did exceptional jobs. Many a time I would get a call or a driver would come in and say, this little one's mother wasn't at home, so I didn't let him off by himself. So they were like a second mother to a lot of these kids. And Charlie didn't mention it, but I know my son was a safety patrol boy, and I don't know that they have those now, but I asked my son about that, and he said, oh, yes. He said, we'd go out on the really cold mornings, and when we'd come into the school, the cafeteria ladies would have hot chocolate for us.
That started with Mrs. Minnick.
That started with Mrs. Minnick, okay. That was very nice, and it was a nice thing for those 5th grade, I think it was, boys that,
5th grade.
5th grade, yes, that were safety
That
patrol.
way you get 2 years out of them.
So I just at this time would like to say thank you to the community for the time I spent as secretary. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I enjoyed working with 5th grade teacher when Shelia Shade.
Thank you, Norma. Oh, my point of view is going to be a little different than theirs because mine, they gave you overall things. Mine's more classroom. Other than the fact that when I first began, I had done I was taking college courses and I was working on my certification, and so I was ready to do my student teaching. And the first year, for half a year, and I was assigned to Mabel Helsinger. So during that year, they had Mrs. Baker that Norma talked about as being one of the primary teachers. But when she came, she was in the 4th grade. And in the 4th grade, Mrs. Minnick was the principal, and she had the primary building, which was just that first section of the complex over there today, and McKinley building. So she spent part of her time over in the primary. Most of her time was spent there. And then Bev Martzel was the secretary, and Elizabeth Walker was her secretary at the primary. And then, so Mrs. Minnick asked me if I would take the 4th grade, because Mrs. Baker had come up here to help take care of her mother, and she had been teaching in Texas. And she had been teaching a slow group of children who needed to have more time with their contents. And she was taking this 4th grade class at that pace. And this 4th grade class was not responding well to that, because she had some boys that were really ambitious little boys. And so Mrs. Minnick had some people in the 1st grade that were not doing as well, so she wanted to take those children out and start another 1st grade class for them. So that's how I started in the middle of the year and going into the 4th grade. And I'd asked my supervisor from Miami if I could do this, if I could start, because our semesters didn't coincide with Miami. And she said no. Well, Mrs. Minnick said, I want you upstairs after Christmas vacation, you go up and take that class. So I went upstairs first, and I did an observation. And the first thing I did was I observed how the dynamics among the children. First thing I did on Monday morning was make a new seating arrangement. And we got along fine. I didn't have any problems with the kids, and they knew that when I told them something, that was the way it was going to be. But I had some rambunctious little boys and they happened to live close together. So they were not just in school, but they were out of school. They were all together. And so we got that settled and went on. But the second year, then I went to 5th grade, because they were going to, I forget if someone resigned or if they had, no, I think they had to add another class. And then Mrs. Minnick was replaced. She resigned, and she was replaced by 2 men. I want you to know. 2 men had that job.
I didn't mention that because...
You didn't want to. But she did an excellent job. And I think the only one that's talking about the schools that has been here for the longest time, Jim was the only one in this group that went through the system. So the rest of them, we've all moved in from other areas. I do remember when my children were going to school, they had 6 weeks of kindergarten in the summer. Miss Dickey and Maud Henderson had the classes, and that's all that they had. When my girls were getting to go into the 5th grade, and Jim was talking about the parents being upset with the students coming, the 6th graders being mixed with the 7th and 8th grade. Well, the 5th and 6th grade were going to high school, and that was really upsetting to many, many parents to think that their children are going to be interacting with those older kids all the time. And so the school has really progressed, as far as this goes. I know that, I'm not real sure if Debbie was in the first year that they had, but when she went to school, she had full-time kindergarten for half a day. And so that has been some of the changes within the system itself. And then as, you know, that old building, that McKinley building, may have had lots of things wrong with it, but there were still some nice things about it also. The rooms were a little larger, for one thing. You had a little more storage space in the hallway for the kids to put their coats and so forth. The one thing that you were talking about, marching the children through a closed enclosure from first grade to the kindergarten cafeteria, in 4th, 5th, and 6th, we got to take the children from the McKinley building out in the open across to the high school for our cafeteria every day, regardless of the weather. Occasionally, when we had rain, the bus would come and pick us up, but not very often.
Rainy days, we had a bus going.
But not very often.
No.
So most of the time so that was, you know, quite an adventure for me. And we only had so many minutes, and part of that meant from the time that you left McKinley till the time that you left the high school. So it was...
Didn't have much time to eat.
No, we didn't have much time to eat, but they had to step lively too. So, but it was an adventure that we all had. One of the things I want to say about the children, always when we went on field trips, we were always complimented on the behavior of our children from this school district. And I think that was, and sometimes people would tell us horror stories of other schools being there and how the children had behaved and things of this sort. But that is something that all the times that I was teaching and so forth, we never had that kind of problem. And I think the people in this area need to be complimented from the standpoint of how their children did behave. Some of the things in the classrooms, I mean, Mr. Tillman told you about all the teachers that were there, so I'm not going to go over that. One of the strangest things that I ever had was a note that was written for this boy missed school for the day. And I received this note from this kid. Please excuse my son from school, but he had to stay home and watch the wedding of the chickens. Paul Dixon at that time had this television program, and they had a rubber hen and a rubber rooster that they were promoting all over the place. And so this boy stayed home for that particular absentee.
I remember her telling me about that.
And I gave it to Mr. Tillman because I thought, well, maybe he'd say it wasn't an excused absence, but he didn't say that. But I think that's the only note that I had that really was out of the ordinary. Some of the improvements that we made within the school was at different times, at least I felt they were improvements, was we would have, when we have our Teachers' Day, that we had to go for OEA Day. Mm-hmm. A lot of times at that time, they'd have, these companies would have big displays. And Mabel and Maud taught me well because they said, Shoya, you need to spend your time, some time here. So sometimes I didn't maybe go to one of the talks, but I would spend the time going through the things, getting ideas of new equipment that I wanted for the classroom. And so I saw this wonderful map and globe thing that Nystrom had out, and I came back and said, Mr. Tillman, we have to get this. Well, no, we didn't have the money right away. Well, every year I kept on until I think he got tired of hearing me haranguing him about it, and we did get it. But the maps were a plastic, and they had the physical features of the United States, and the kids could feel, you know, we could talk about the different formations of the terrain in the United States, and go through this, and we'd have the globes, and we had globes for every two. Of course, the first thing the kids did was bring, and make the globe swirl and swirl, and let them be for a little bit, and I said, no, that's enough. And they would stop, but I think they really did enjoy it. And Mr. Tomlin talked about the reading program that we had, and especially, I don't see how we could have, well, we wouldn't have been able to have had that many different groups of dividing in reading groups within our own classrooms, because we had 7 or 8 sometimes.
I inherited that system. That was Mrs. Minnick's system.
That's Mrs. Minnick's system.
Right.
But I think it was one that worked well, because those who were in the top group were really challenged beyond just reading a story, and they got more out of it. And I think the child who had not gotten all of the phonics and gotten some things, they were smaller classes, and they had individual things that they could work within. Can't seem to think of anything else, other than I did want to say, I was later, after I retired, I served on the school board, and during that period of time, in the late 80s and into the 90s, is when we really delved into the technology. And we got the computer systems and things of this sort, and I really feel that people in this community have always received the best that they could get from the amount of money that was spent from the school. It was wisely spent. It was not foolish on a lot of frills or things of this sort. Within the classroom, no, you didn't get everything that you always wrote down that you wanted. But it isn't always good for you to get everything that you want, because sometimes your list, you need to have something carry over. And sometimes what you wanted one year, well, you forget that wasn't that important. But by and large, I feel that the people in this community have always had caring teachers, teachers who really cared about the students. And for the most part, they were well prepared. And so I'll pass it on and let Sally tell it from the high school.
Well, mine's going to have to be brief, because
Right.
I have to take 2 of my grandkids out to Lowry, one for a softball game and one to get ready for baseball practice. But I started out in the high school exclusively, pretty much, because I just happened to fall into this job. I met Sue Coate, who was the chemistry teacher, and she introduced me to Ed, and I started subbing in 1970. And just as fate would have it, in 2 years, why, they had an opening and needed a teacher, and Ed gives me a call and said, I want you to think about taking the job. I don't think I was ever really interviewed or anything. I met with Jack, I remember, and Ed, and they're like, well, you're it. So, okay, I started work there, and I always tell everybody I gave half of my life there at that school, and I don't believe there is a room in that high school that I haven't been in teaching something, either as a sub or as a health teacher. You very rarely ever had your own classroom, so you went from one room to the next room to the next room, and they're really, I love that building. Even today, and I walk up there and see that building, it gets emotional. I love the building. And you know from listening to Ed and Jim, we had great administrators, and I feel very lucky. I really worked for 2 principals, and that was Ed and Alan Smith. And they loved that school. I have no doubt about it. And people ask me sometimes, how could you have coached? I coached 33 years at Milton. How did you coach that long? And I always say, I had a vested interest in that school. My kids went to school there. My grandkids all go to school here. I loved the place. Ed came up with so many great things, and that old track came in handy, didn't it, Jim? As you guys walked around, because I tell you, Senior Citizens Day was fantastic, and Ed was the greatest cheerleader. He may not have been a great cheerleader coach, but I'll tell you what, he was the best cheerleader there ever was, because, man, I'll tell you, by the time he got through with you at Pep Assembly, you could have gone out there on Friday night and played, because he had everybody so fired up. And it's been a disappointment in a way to me when I go now, and it's just like, okay, come on, you guys, let's go. Let's get fired up. And I feel like I was very fortunate to have connection with Jim. I'm a Tennessee girl, so when I came up here, I had grown up with girls' sports being big time, okay? And when I came here and I took over, I coached cross country, volleyball, bowling, basketball, and track for $150. That was it. And it's like Jim said, you put in a lot of hours, only we weren't allowed to even practice but one day a week in volleyball and basketball. You didn't play that many games, but you weren't allowed to have the gym until Title IX came into existence. And you used to have cookies and milk with the opponents after the game. Well, in Tennessee, that would have never worked, because you would have probably had a fist fight or something, because if any of you know anything about the Tennessee Lady Vols and Pat Summitt, the coach there, that's the kind of basketball I grew up with. So I was like, what is this? I just don't get it. So I think that's why I was driven so much to change it. And Jim, I'll give you a lot of credit, because you really pushed to help get the girls part of the SWBL started. You remember when we worked on that?
Yeah.
And that totally changed things. It did. It was great. And I tell you what, I don't deserve any credit for anything, because we had the best female athletes, the best girls going through this school that gave her all. They were appreciative. They loved to compete, and it makes me sad to think about some of those girls before that who never got that opportunity. And I will have to say, Sharon Pinkerton was the greatest assistant coach ever, and we really made a good pair, we two. We had a great faculty. Linda is one of my friends. We still get together and go out to eat when we either one have time. But you know what? Life moves on. School's going to move on. I've had the opportunity to tour the new building a couple of times already. It's going to be amazing. It is going to be amazing. And I give Ed, I give Jim, I give Alan all the credit in the world for how great that high school has been through the years, and making us a great faculty, because you always got that note, see me, EL, with a circle around. You're like, oh, I gotta go see Ed. Wonder what this is about. But he always, he had the greatest ideas for that school. And if he didn't know a student by name, he's always like, hey, Sal, what's that kid's name over there? Because he knew that I had everybody in class, and I would know who the kids were. And he wanted to know them personally. And I tell you what, that's the way you should be a principal, I believe. And he made us all feel like we were special, and so we did for him as much as we could to make that school the way it was. So I loved every minute of it, every minute. I'm going to pass this on to Linda Varner, who taught home ec. I have to go. I'm so sorry, but I have to go, because I got to meet my kids at 3 to take them to Lowry. So I've enjoyed listening to everybody, and it's great to see all of you too. So thank you.
Thanks, Sally. I love working at Milton Union. My experiences with Milton were different, because I was in college with Linda Hunt, Linda Hemrick Hunt, and she used to talk about West Milton, because we lived across the hall from each other and had dinner together every night. And I'd say, West Milton? I would never go to West Milton. Well, needless to say, 6 months later, I had to eat my words when I got interviewed for a job at West Milton. And I started teaching at West Milton in 1971 and retired from there after 30 years of teaching. One of the main things I saw, the changes at West Milton, is when I first started at Milton, we only taught girls. Betty Benkin and I were the 2 home ec teachers. And in 1971, Jack Williams and Ed Lindinsky decided that we were going to expand the program. We were going to add a 3rd teacher. We were going to each have 4 classes, which meant we have over 200 kids in our department in a day's time. And we were going to offer classes to boys. This was before Title I, though. But we taught lots of things, independent living and single survival to the boys, so they could meet their needs as being fathers and young gentlemen, in addition to all the other girls that we taught. I was a freshman teacher and taught just freshman girls for about 10 years. That was a real trip in itself. And you could hear me saying, "Girls, now get quiet, girls, now get quiet." Another part of our program was that we did home visits. Our department was the only department that did home visits, and we would meet the parents in the summertime and explain the program to the students, mainly because we had home projects to do, and that was an extra 1/4 of a credit for the kids. Rather than just being a credit, we were a credit and a 1/4 for vocational home economics. And it was a real pleasure to get to meet the parents. I often met many, many parents, and this was before mothers had to go back to work. And I probably have been in every other house in Union Township. That's how many home visits I made in 30 years. I was advisor for FHA, which was Future Homemakers of America. It's now known as Family, Consumer, and Career Leaders of America. Just as the name of home economics has changed, it's now Family and Consumer Sciences. And we did all kinds of activities with our extracurricular activities. One event that stands out in my mind was in the mid-'80s, and we took a train ride from Dayton, Ohio, to Indianapolis with the FHA girls, and we had a train wreck on the way there. And believe it or not, it was minor, so it wasn't a big deal, but we did just have to stop for a few minutes to see that the truck driver was okay, that the truck we hit. And then we spent the day in Indianapolis visiting museums, and we came back that night. And we had many parents that went with us just because they had never been on a train ride. So that was fun. Another event we used to do was Fall Fair with FFA, before FFA and the Ag Department was dissolved. So that was fun. And we made homemade apple butter out at Boyd Baker's house and cooked it over a big copper kettle. That was fun. The main changes I've seen, of course, the name changes that we've gone through. Another one that I see, which is sad, is the decline, the importance of homemaking skills or everyday living skills, as I call them. We went from a 3-teacher department, now it's down to 1-person department. And I've heard that there won't even be family consumer science even offered next year at the new high school, which is very sad for me because in this economy, I think we need those skills. Kids need those skills. They need to know how to cook and not heat a meal in a microwave. So that upsets me. Another outstanding event we had, I thought, was, of course, well, Ed talked about Senior Citizens Day, but he forgot that I used to prepare meals for 200 senior citizens plus 100 students that day. We didn't just decorate the cafeteria.
Linda, one other thing you did, too, that I'd almost forgotten about. We used to have a C.C. Dickey golf outing. And when it first began, Charlie Dickey, a lot of you will remember him. He was a big booster of athletics. One year, I got put in charge of the meal. I asked you, and you volunteered your services and the home ec girls, and we had the steak dinner in the cafeteria. That took a lot of effort
Oh,
and
yeah.
time out from you guys.
We used to prepare a board dinner every year at Christmas time for board members.
Yeah.
We did that. And so there's a lot of good things that we did. The FHA activities we did were fantastic. One of the biggest things I remember is every year we would take a group of students to Columbus for state convention. And that was a big thing. The kids earned it according to how many points they earned for different activities. And this one gal we took, her name I'll not mention, that was the first time she had ever stayed in a hotel. And you would, well, now kids do that all the time, but here she was 14 or 15 years old, never stayed in a hotel before. She was so sick all night because she was so nervous about being out of town and away from her family. And we've done so many neat things, like the trip on the train to Indianapolis. I mean, the train doesn't even run from Dayton anymore. And just neat things like that. We took a group of kids to Indianapolis for a national convention. Took like 15 kids. It was wonderful. We had such a good time. And Milton has a very fond a place in my heart. I sub at CTC now, and I always mention to the kids from Milton, I used to teach there, and we'd always somehow find a connection of someone we knew. So it's just been a really neat experience. Thank you.
I wanted to say something about the board dinner. I remember now that she used to prepare those board dinners. I got to go to one. It was the year that Bob Osborne was going to retire. And so they invited the principals to come to that board dinner. And that was the only one. That was a good meal, if I remember right. Good meal.
Thank you, thank you, thank you all
Can
very, very much.
I make a couple other
Sure.
observations?
Sure.
They mentioned, a number of people mentioned Bob Osborne, and Bob was not in the active in the schools when I came,
No.
but he was when I was a student. Mr. Osborne was someone that you didn't fool with. Now, I don't know that he ever lost his temper with anyone,
He had
but
a
no
dominating
one ever pushed him to the point where he would lose his temper. Everyone was, what Mr. Osborne said, we did. And he was a nice, then meeting him after I got out of school, he was probably the nicest individual I've ever met. But the kids respected him highly when they were in school.
He had a dominating personality, but he was a very friendly and open man. I got to know him because he hired me. And I got to know him real well. And he was a great man, and I was trying to remember something that he said to me one time. The other thing I wanted to say about him was, you said he was a strong person, a strong personality. He told me a story about he and his brother. He had a brother who was either a year or two older or a year or two younger. And they would go around in southern Ohio. He came down from West Union or down in there somewhere. But they would go around to the county fairs, and his brother would be in the wrestling or up in the ring, and he would be challenging people to come up and box, And he said he and his brother would switch roles. He would be in the ring, and his brother would be out in the crowd, or he would be out in the crowd, and his brother would be in the ring, and they would challenge each other and get up there and fight in the ring, He was a barnstormer like type of that, but he told me some things he did as a young man, and he was a great personality. Bob Osborne was a great man.
Someone else I'd like to mention. When Title IX came in, it meant just scheduling. I mean, you had girls' teams and everything now, and prior to that time, our facilities were such that we didn't have too much trouble scheduling boys' events. But when it came to, the girls and the boys both, it was really a big challenge. And I was athletic director then, and after a couple of years, I told Mr. Williams, I said, hey, I can't do assistant principal and athletic director. I need some help. And we got Malcolm Smoot. Malcolm was teaching phys ed, And he became the assistant athletic director, and then he went on and became the athletic director after that. But we still have problems with facilities. It's going to be a shame to lose this nice big gym that we have, because we're still going to have a lot of things to schedule, boys and girls events, and we're still going to be stressed for some of the facilities. And when I came back to Milton in '71, I can always remember when I was in school how big the hallways were. And, you know, they were nice and large and uncrowded. And someone shrank the building. Because when I came back in '71, the hallways were much narrower and they were a lot more crowded. Of course, there were probably twice as many kids in the hallway at that time as when I was in school.
I walked in the McKinley building. I couldn't believe the width of the hallways in the McKinley building. My
Those were
goodness.
great.
Oh, you could put other rooms in there.
Yeah, another thing that I remember too that I hadn't even thought about until the other day. I was at a Miami County grant meeting, and they were giving grants to various organizations, schools, and so forth. And several of the schools asked for grants so that they could join Muse Machine. Well, we did that way back in 1970.
Oh, way back.
Something or other.
We used to
I
have
remember
music up
the gal by the name of Susie Bassani came into my building, and she was very, very English. And she came into my building, and she's explaining all this, you know. And I'm thinking, well, you know, our kids don't get exposed to arts at all. They didn't get exposed to arts at all. And I thought, this probably would be really good. So it started down in the middle school, and it started with a contemporary dance group, the Dayton Ballet came in. We had a Philharmonic, not the Philharmonic, but some small groups came in from the Philharmonic, and the kids really loved it. They really loved it, and they really enjoyed it. I think it was really good that they could be exposed to something like this where they hadn't before.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. This has been wonderful. Thank you in the audience, and thank all of you so much. And we'll remember this day. It's been great. Thanks.
Fun.